This is a story for Halloween. It's called Smoke and Bones. The Halloween party had finished early, too early, and there was far too much food left over. Pretty much all of it hadn't been touched. The soufflés still had a vestige of life in them. The cocktail sausages, usually the first to go, remained piled up and skewered with their pineapple and cheese chunks on the little wooden sticks, and no one had touched the cheesecake. And as for the apple and rum punch, barely a glassful had been consumed. You see, the smoke had put an end to it all, and the commotion, the panic. It's a wonder that no one was hurt in the stampede for the door. Off-duty PC Bluebottle reported later at the inquest how impressed he was with the overall behaviour of the frightened crowd. Had the incident occurred later in the evening, after most had pickled their livers, well, things would have been worse, far worse. He shuddered to think how much worse. The very notion of half the population of Fetching Down, and let's be fair, a good portion of neighbouring Bovington Malady, milling about the village hall that night, guzzling highly alcoholic home brew, gave him the willies. Incredibly, his super had given him the night off, and knowing that PC Bluebottle would be attending in an off-duty capacity, he hadn't bothered to slate another officer in his place, in case things had become a bit salty, which, in the ordinary way of things, they would have. Drunks are drunks, after all, and thugs from Fetching Down are, at the end of the day, and particularly at the end of the day, much the same as thugs from Bovington Malady or any other small provincial town or rural village, especially with several pints of apple and rum punch inside them. Yet on this occasion the chance to quench one's thirst with apple and rum punch hadn't availed itself because of the smoke. It's a very insidious thing, smoke. The truism that there's no smoke without fire isn't necessarily true at all, unless you count the heated element of a hot plate of a smoke machine as fire, or indeed the two volatile substances that, once mixed together, produce a smoke bomb, emitting that foggy compound that clogs your eyes. Yet neither of these mechanisms were responsible for the sudden materialisation of the thick white puffy clouds seeping through the polished oak floorboards of Fetching Down's village hall. Spontaneous human combustion, however, was, or at least that was the bizarre verdict the inquest committee gave. Spontaneous human combustion. But not of the living kind, no, the deceased, a corpse. Well, in fact, two corpses buried beneath the brick-built Victorian hall sometime in the 1700s. Now, as macabre as this may sound, and believe me, it does sound very macabre, and in equal measure preposterous, all I can say is the explanation that unfolds is nonetheless true. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that the village folk weren't aware of the buried parties residing some 6 to 10 feet under the foundations of Fetching Down's central meeting house. They very much were. There was a plaque inside the hall dedicated to the two dead millers, and their surnames appeared alongside the hoarding above the entrance, the Jack and Henry Sullington Memorial and Village Hall. A little worn now, the sign, and overgrown with ivy, but still there. What the villagers weren't aware, and this only came to light 2 days after the smoke cleared and the Halloween victuals had all been removed, the rum punch wickedly poured down the roadside drain, and much of the sausages and soufflé having been given to the pigs at Burrow Farm, was the state of the dead bodies below. PC Bluebottle and St Christopher's gravedigger Percy Goodbetter had been assigned to enter the mausoleum through the only aperture available via the roof. With torches ablaze, they were lowered down. 10 minutes later, and back out breathing the fresh air on the street outside the village hall, both men reported what they had witnessed. Charred bones. Charred human bones. The blackened skull of Jack, or perhaps it was Henry, it was very difficult to discern inside the tomb, was dismembered from the rest of its skeleton and lay on the floor in the corner. The other brother's bones rested on the slab where the corpse was originally lain in the 18th century, intact but pretty much burnt to a crisp, or so it seemed. And so spontaneous human combustion was recorded. It was in fact many years later that the truth of the situation was explained, when the hall was eventually demolished. A brief glance at the local history showed that before the village hall was built, there stood a windmill on the site. In 1759, during a great tempest, the post mill blew down and was smashed to 1,000 pieces. The millers, Jack and Henry Sullington, had been trying to tie down the sails as the storm blew, but perished when the mill came crashing down. So in their honour, the men were buried in a mausoleum made of brick on the same spot. The access was made through the roof, and on top of which were placed several bags of flour, pretty much acting as sandbags to keep the moisture out. Over the next few centuries, the village had naturally grown in size. Electricity, water, gas soon arrived. The Victorian village hall had been built over the windmill spot and where the mausoleum stood, and during the laying of the foundations of the hall, builders had inadvertently loosened the earth above the mausoleum, exposing the sacks of flour. Now, when the Halloween party got into full swing, an old gas pipe, which now ran through the mausoleum and was in need of desperate repair, burst. The gas pressure built up inside the miller's tomb. It ripped out the rotting hatch in the roof and blew the dried powdery flour from the long perished sacks through the floorboards in the village hall into thick clouds where the Halloween party was gathered, much to the shock and consternation of the party goers. The gas main was fortunately shut off further up the system, so the broken pipe wasn't known about when the policeman and gravedigger had descended into the mausoleum. And as for the charred bones, simply the natural discoloration of mildew and mould over the centuries, giving, it has to be said, a rather macabre charred effect. An easy mistake to make for P.C. Bluebottle and Percy Goodbetter in the limited light from their torches. That said, the legend of the spontaneous human combustion of the dead stayed associated with the village hall, and most of the residents of Fletching Down refused to enter the building from then on in. It was eventually demolished and turned into a car park. But strangely, any vehicles left parked overnight on Halloween are discovered the following morning to be covered in a thin, white, powdery substance, not entirely unlike flour. Odd, really.